Hello, my name is Chantal Ridsdale, and I'm a data steward at Ocean Networks Canada. I'll be giving you a brief introduction to research data management and data citation today. I will cover what research data management, or RDM, is and why we need it, the research data lifecycle in relation to data management planning using persistent identifiers, or PIDs, citing data, and a few conclusions and resources. What is research data? They are primary sources that support research, data that are collected from observation or created as output. Data can be used to validate and replicate results, can also be a source for new research, and increasingly viewed as an important product of research in itself. Research data management refers to the organization, storage, and preservation of data created during a research project. It covers initial planning, day-to-day processes, and long-term archiving and sharing. This includes activities relating to data policies, data planning, data element standardization, information management control, data synchronization, data sharing, database development, and more, including practices and projects that acquire, control, protect, deliver, enhance the value of data and information. Why do we need RDM, or research data management? It keeps data safe and secure, minimizes data loss, increases data accuracy, authenticity, and reliability, improves research integrity, increasing reproducibility of results, diminishes duplication of research efforts, allows researchers to meet funder requirements, and facilitates online sharing to increase visibility and collaboration. Some of you may already be familiar with the FAIR data principles to varying degrees, but I'll describe them a bit just in case. In 2016, the FAIR Guiding Principles for Scientific Data Management and Stewardship were published in Scientific Data. The authors intended to provide guidelines to improve the findability, accessibility, interoperability, and reuse of digital assets. The principles emphasize machine actionability, i.e., the capacity of computational systems to find, access, interoperate, and reuse data with no or minimal human intervention, because humans increasingly rely on computational support to do with data as a result of the increase in volume, complexity, and creation speed of data. To unpack that a little bit, findable. The first step in reusing data is to find them. Metadata and data should be easy to find for both humans and computers. Machine-readable metadata are essential for automatic discovery of data sets and services, so there is an essential component of the verification process. Accessible. Once the user finds the required data, they need to know how they can be accessed, possibly including authentication and authorization. Interoperable. The data usually needs to be integrated with other data. In addition, the data need to interoperate with applications or workflows for analysis, storage, and processing. For example, the units of measure must be clearly defined programmatically so that users can integrate it with other data sets or know that they must convert. Or the metadata schemas and elements should be implemented the same so that scripts can be used to search for these parameters across data sets and/or repositories. Reusable. The ultimate goal of FAIR is to optimize the reuse of data. To achieve this, metadata and data should be well described so that they can be replicated and/or combined in different settings. You likely are familiar with the research data lifecycle through your work, but I'd like to highlight how research data management can be included in the lifecycle's activities. It's worth clarifying that the activities in the middle of the image, secure, store, discover, and document and curate, are stages that occur iteratively throughout the research data lifecycle. The following slides will cover how to document and curate throughout. Planning does not just apply to the data, or the project. It also applies to research data management. There are questions that a researcher can answer / information that can be documented prior to the project starting, such as, what is the purpose of the research? What types of data are being collected or acquired? What file formats? Are there non-proprietary equivalents, i.e. Excel can be converted to CSV as open source or non-proprietary? What documentation and metadata schemas are required? How will the data be stored, backed up, and preserved? What requirements or obligations exist from funders, partners, institutions, and publishers? What requirements or restrictions exist on sharing data? So, data management planning. DMPs, or data management plans, are becoming more prevalent with funding agencies requiring them upon proposal submission. DMPs are not meant to be developed in a vacuum. Your library and/or research office can provide help and/or point you to people or resources available to researchers to help with this step. Various tools exist to help you build a data management plan as well. The few that are based on local guidelines and requirements are one in Canada called the DMP Assistant, one in the UK called the DMP Online, and one in the US, the DMP Tool. DMPs are living documents and can and should be edited throughout the life cycle of data if anything changes. Create or collect. Things to consider before and or while you collect data. The data file format preferred to be non-proprietary, as I mentioned before, so .txt, .csv, .netcdf. Create a README before data collection. I'll cover this in the next slide. Clear file names. I'll cover this in a subsequent slide. Codes used for interpreting the data, column headers and units of measure defined and documented, any significance for the environmental or experimental conditions that users should know. So README files. Documents and provides metadata for the data sets. Written in clear language in plain .txt format, provided for each logically related set of data. It should include title, date, geographic information, and contact details for the data set, descriptions and dates for each file in the data set, licensing and other usage information, description of how the data was collected and processed, variables, definitions, column headings, units of measure, etc., and any other details as appropriate or required. These are also known as code books or data dictionaries. There may be other names that I'm not familiar with, but those are the ones I know. And I'm going to do a quick demo of an ONC code book to show you how this is done in real life. So this is associated with the data package that we have published on our Dataverse. It begins with a file list. So it lists literally every file that's associated in this package. So in this particular example, we didn't have just a data file. We included all of the ancillary files that would help inform users on the entire deployment and data set. So including calibration information and a plot for the 7 years of this, as well as the deployment history. There's a MATLAB, NetCDF, and CSV data. These are all the same data, just different formats for different users. And a drawn diagram of site, how it's set up and things like that. The next is a relationship between files. So if there's any files that interact with each other that a user should know before downloading. Oh, I should also mention that these files are not just listed. There's also brief descriptions of what those files include, so users can identify before they download. It also goes into any additional related data collected. So in this particular package, we focus on CTD, which is conductivity, temperature, and depth instrument, as well as its co-located oxygen sensor. But at that same site, on that same platform, there is a co-located acoustic Doppler current profiler, bottom pressure recorder, and an echo sounder. So other users that are interested in this might also be interested in those data sets, which can be found at data.oceannetworks.ca through our data repository. The README also specifies versions. So this is the first version of this particular data set. So no additional versions are identified. Any methodological information, descriptions for collecting or generating the data that users would benefit from knowing. Methods for processing the data, so is it cleaned, averaged, etc. Any instrument or software specific information. So as you saw above, there is a MATLAB script or MATLAB file involved. So that would require particular proprietary software. Going further into this, we also get into the environmental and experimental conditions for the 7-year time series. And we described the quality assurance procedures performed by the data analytics and quality team at Ocean Networks Canada. We listed the people involved in assembling the package. And then last but not least, it's the data specific information where it's specified the file particularly, and then the field names, structures and dimensions, etc. are all defined. And this goes for each data file itself. So it is quite long, but it is very valuable for users that were not involved in the initial collection of the data set and for reuse and reproducibility sake. So moving on, file naming. Their best practices include a short form of the project name, brief description of the file's content, date in a recognizable form, sequentially numbered file versions, use hyphens or underscores rather than spaces, file extensions must indicate the format. And there's a few examples here of how Ocean Networks Canada has implemented these in our code books for our Dataverse data packages. These include a site layout diagram. So this is a PDF, and the other is a calibration sheet. So it should be mentioned that a best effort should be made to follow the conventions, but not all pieces will apply to all cases. So don't force a square peg into a round hole. Do what makes sense for your project. So for these two examples, the site layout diagram doesn't have an instrument name associated because there's many instruments that are associated with it. So it didn't make sense for us to include that, but for the calibration sheet, we did include the name and the serial number for that for users to better identify what that calibration sheet included. So moving on, process and analysis. The README should include if the data was cleaned, changed, averaged, or processed in any way. If so, it should be described for users not involved in the initial processing for reproducibility, and document code and or tools used. Disseminate. So data deposit is not just a data dump. Ensure that your data is fair and documented. Deposit in a repository that is as open as possible and as closed as necessary. This means that the data should be open by default, but can be closed if it's necessary. So if it's sensitive or personally identifiable information are included, health information associated with a small community where even if codes are used, it might be too easy to identify people involved in that study, in Indigenous specific data, in that sort of thing. So where the repository will be able to help you identify which your data set should be open or closed, if you're not sure. At the disseminate stage, you should be creating or associating PIDs or persistent identifiers, so DOIs, ORCIDs, and RORs for proper attributions. I'll get into this in a little bit later. And the readme.txt should be included in the data package that's published. Preserve. Identification of repository will help the researcher identify what should be preserved, how, and for how long. Preservation is a separate step from backing up. This is intended for longer terms, more complete data, and more general purposes. Using repository allows data to be preserved and made available without researchers having to handle all aspects of maintenance. Last but not least, reuse. Representing your data with PIDs such as DOIs allow for easy, consistent reuse and attribution. Ensuring the data and processing steps are documented in the README properly so data can be reused, reproduced appropriately, and providing suggested citation text for users to copy and paste easily. So as I mentioned before, persistent identifiers are important, and they are a long-lasting reference to a document, person, file, web page, or other object, whether real or digital. Components of a PID include a unique identifier, a service that resolves the identifier to the object, even if its location changes, and metadata about the object. There are many different types of persistent identifiers, including but not limited to DOIs, ORCIDs, and RORs, which I will discuss briefly with you in the next slides. DOIs, or digital object identifiers, are a code used to permanently and stably identify usually digital objects. DOIs provide a standard mechanism for retrieval of metadata about the object and generally a means to access the data object itself. They're used for journal articles, data, reports, publications, and more. Remains the same for the lifetime of document, though metadata, including object location URL, can change with time. DOIs are not immediate. They require data curation documentation, so do not expect to receive a DOI immediately upon submission to a repository. Contact the repository well in advance of your journal submission. Connecting DOIs to data, publications, and journals allows for data article issue to be more easily accessible by a click of a mouse. ORCIDs, they are open researcher and contributor identifiers. It's a nonprofit organization issuing persistent identifiers for individual researchers. One identifier to track contributions, affiliations, name changes, and allow unique identification of users with common names. And when ORCIDs are connected with individuals, it allows for them to be more easily identifiable from other researchers that may have the same name or if they change their name. Research Organization Registry, or ROR, is a community-led project to develop open, sustainable, usable, and unique identifiers for research organizations. ROR IDs store metadata about organizations such as alternate names, abbreviations, external URLs, and other identifiers such as Wikidata, ISNIs, and the Open Funder Registry to support interoperability. Connecting RORs to institutions allows them to be more identifiable if there are any other organizations that may share their acronym. To unpack persistent identifiers a bit more, ORCIDs are for people, RORs are for research organizations, and DOIs are for objects, i.e. data, journals, articles, and more. Connecting RORs, ORCIDs, and DOIs allows for these PIDs to interact with one another and show the impact and reuse of their interactions. Additionally, it allows for metrics to be more easily and programmatically derived from different perspectives, i.e. how many data sets were used from an institutional perspective, how many of the researchers were funded by the same funding agency, how many data sets were reused for a particular researcher, etc. To summarize, the value of PIDs. In order to show the real value of PIDs, let's consider two cases. In one case, a team of scientists utilize PIDs in their work, upper green, and the other case is when a group of scientists don't use PIDs, lower brown. So once the paper hits the scientific world, researchers may want to build on the research or reproduce the results. This requires access to the original data set used in the publication. In the case when PIDs were used, it is as simple as a few clicks to access the correct version of the data set. In the case where PIDs were not used, this researcher may find data online, but there's no way for the researcher to know if it's the correct version or if it's curated with appropriate metadata, Data can change after publication for many reasons, including but not limited to errors in calibration formulas, corrections to reference data, etc. Or they may have to request the data from the author. When they request the data, it can be quite time-consuming without a guarantee the time will be worth it. Often researchers will have moved on to a new project and have no interest in sharing data they have to describe to a new user. Overall, a team that used PIDs can clearly track how their paper was used in the scientific community, how much more research was conducted based on their findings, how many times it was cited, quoted, etc. All those metrics can be easily found with a few clicks of the mouse. On the other hand, the team that didn't use PIDs doesn't really know the impact of their paper on scientific community. They have limited metrics to track the use of their data and their research. The team that used PIDs will get credit and recognition for their work. The team that didn't use PIDs might get some credit, but they might not be aware of it. And for sure, they will not get all the credit they deserve due to not being able to track the metrics of their paper in an easy way. So what is data citation? Data citation is a reference to data for the purpose of credit attribution and facilitation of access to the data. This definition comes from the Task Group of Data Citation Standards and Practices from 2013, but still holds up. The citing data is just like citing a book or journal article. Access should be enabled for both humans and machines. Citing data establishes it as a first-class product of research and provides more ways to define a researcher's success and impact than the traditional number of publications in high-impact journals / the number of paper citations, metric that has reigned in academia for decades. But why? Science is doing just fine without data citation, right? So a short history of science. Science has historically often been secretive and data siloed. The world's first academic science journal, Philosophical Transactions, was published by the Royal Society in 1665. Journal publications became the gold standard for conveying research results, leading to publish or perish. Academia and industry have both contributed to this culture of increasingly closed science over time. Everyone maintained their own data in whatever terrible way they saw fit. Data was hidden, hoarded, and kept secret to prevent theories and other intellectual property being scooped. Continue to get further value out of their data. They might have more research planned, or just because no one knew what to do with it or had anywhere public to store it. Leading to replication and reproducibility crisis. Inability to access raw data was a factor in the replication crisis because you can't replicate a study unless you have the actual data. Importance of data citation. So authors get due credit. It helps to identify and find the data, promotes research reproducibility, facilitates collaboration, helps track the impact and reuse of data sets, increases the discoverability of the research. So citing data and software is one of the key practices leading to recognition of data and software as a primary research output. When data citations and metadata use persistent identifiers like DOIs, we can leverage those PIDs to get more accurate metrics for which of our data is being used and cited. So published research data is cited just like other scholarly outputs. Styles and formats for data varies in the same way article citation styles and formats vary. So elements of data citation are title, not the title of the associated publication. It should describe the data itself. Authors and creators, the individuals responsible for creation of the data. The publisher, repository where the author has deposited the data set for long-term storage. The PID, a long-lasting reference to an object. For data sets, usually a DOI, not strictly necessary to cite at something. You can see the entire history of publishing, but makes it exponentially easier, particularly for digital objects not usually published in hard copy. Publication date, the date the data was made available to the public, i.e. placed in a repository, not the paper publication date, not the date the data was collected. Those are captured elsewhere in the metadata. As with the journal citations, there are no universal reference style for data. Different disciplines and journals use different formats, but the basic pieces above are the same. Repositories often provide a preferred data citation to copy and paste, which ONC does as well. So data availability statements. This is not the same as a data citation. I should repeat that. Data availability statements are not the same as a data citation. It describes compliance with the publisher's specific data policy. So for example, PLOS journals require our authors to make all data necessary to replicate their study's findings publicly available without restriction at the time of publication. When specific legal or ethical restrictions prohibit public sharing of a data set, authors must indicate how others may obtain access to the data. So this does not replace a data citation. Again, data availability statements do not replace data citation. You can have a data citation and know a data availability statement, but you should never have only a data availability statement and no data citation. So a few conclusions for you to leave with. Research data management is not an individual activity. Your library and or research office are available to help direct you to resources and people that can help you through the process. The research lifecycle, you should document throughout this process at each stage. Data management plans are living documents, can be changed and updated as appropriate. DOIs are not immediate to mint. Work is involved by researchers, and always cite data. So a few helpful resources that I've compiled from throughout the presentation, but also in addition, this read-through data, you can identify repositories to put your data. There's a CODATA RDM terminology, which gives you more of a dictionary understanding and make sure that your terms and the vocabulary you're using match up to other people and disciplines. Those 3 data management plan tools that I had mentioned before, a little bit more reading about FAIR data principles, and the Research Data Alliance, which is a great international organization that is a ground roots effort and is very great for publishing best practice documents and helping users understand better. So DynaCite is supported in part by funding from Digital Research Alliance of Canada. We thank them for their contributions, and we thank our other funders as well. Thank you very much for your time.